Thank you so much for having me. So I'm going to read a little excerpt from the Night Diary. And it's in a diary format about a 12-year-old girl who has to leave her home during the partition of India. And she writes in a diary to her mother, who's no longer living, about what she's experiencing. So this is taking place this entry is August 15th, 1947. Dear Mama, it's happening now. Sorry I haven't written you for 6 whole days. The last few days have blended into one. There has been packing and Dadi trying to hide her crying, and lots of stern explaining from Papa. Amil keeps running from Papa to Dadi to Kazi, asking questions. I am silent. No words of mine could change anything. Papa tells us with change, good and bad things will come. At midnight, while we were sleeping, India became independent from British rule. At the same moment, Pakistan, a new country, now exists. Where I live is not called India anymore. I'm still not sure what it means to be free from British rule. Papa says they've ruled over India for almost 200 years. I don't feel British at all. English children from the books or newspapers I've seen don't look like I do. They have light skin. They wear different clothes. I know Papa drinks English tea and has English biscuits. I know that there is a British guard who stands outside the Mir Prakash City Hospital. I know that we have British furniture in our bungalow, like the upholstered wooden chairs in the sitting room and our large oval dining table and English china. I also know that the British aren't going to be the rulers anymore. And I guess we don't like British people telling us what to do. Will Papa drink different tea? Will the guard leave? Will we have to give back the chairs and table? Pakistan was for the Muslims and everyone else will go to India, which isn't here anymore. I wondered if any Hindus were staying anyway. Amil asked Papa the same question, but Papa says it's not safe and the fighting will probably get worse. All non-Muslims in Mir Prakash have to leave and the Muslims in the new India are coming here. Papa says it was a group decision between Lord Mountbatten for the British, Jinnah for the Muslims, and Nehru for everyone else. They all agreed to partition. Amil asked if Gandhi was part of that group. Papa said that Gandhi wants united India, that we are all Indian no matter what faith we follow. But it doesn't matter now, he says. The decisions have been made and we must make the best of it and go peacefully. So as of today, the ground I'm standing on is not India anymore. And Kazi is supposed to live in one place, and we're supposed to leave and find a new home. Is there a Muslim girl sitting in her house right now who has to leave her home and go to a new country that's not even called India? Does she feel confused and scared too? But here is the question that is most on my mind. I'm afraid to say it, even afraid to write it down. I don't want to think about the answer, but my pencil needs to write it anyway. If you were alive, would we have to leave you because you were Muslim? Would they have drawn a line right through us, Mama? I don't care what the answer is. We came from you. We will always be a part of you. And this will always be my home, even if it's called something else. Love, Misha.
That's beautiful. That is also my favorite part. Hello, everyone. My name is Anu, and now we will switch to a Q&A session in which Veera is going to answer some of the questions that have been submitted for this segment and for this book. So Veera, I'm so happy to see you again.
You too.
So as you know, Veera, we've talked about this. Your book is very special in my household because I read this book with my boys and then we read it with my mother. All 3 of us, I've got 2 boys. So I really, really feel the power and strength of this book. And I have some of my questions that I'm going to ask you. But first, let's switch to some of the questions that have been submitted. So Veera, if you can start by telling us the inspiration for writing the Night Diary.
Sure. So my father grew up in Mir Prakash, what is now Mir Prakash, Pakistan, and had to leave his home when he was 9 during the partition with my grandparents and his siblings, my aunts and uncles. And they went from that area to, at first, Jodhpur and then eventually Mumbai, Bombay then. And I grew up in the US, in Connecticut, where I didn't hear a lot about really anything about the partition or India's independence. I didn't live in an area where there were a lot of South Asian kids. And I also am from a mixed background. So my mother was born in this country and she is Jewish. So that added another layer of things. But I would hear from my aunts and uncles stories about what happened during the partition and how they had to leave and how it was scary, but they did make it safely and they had to kind of start all over and they really lost everything they had. And I always thought when I was a little kid that it was just this sort of scary thing that happened to my father's family that I didn't really understand. And the first time I really understood what a huge piece of our global history it is actually when I saw the Hollywood movie Gandhi, when it came out when I was 11 and we all went to see it as a family, and seeing how partition was depicted in that movie. I just couldn't believe that was what my father had been talking about. And why I hadn't really heard more about it. And I think it just stuck with me. And I didn't know I'd grow up to be a writer. But when I did, I thought it was really important in my way to preserve how I understood the history, the questions I wanted to ask about it and explore about it. And also to write it for young readers, for a new generation who I thought, for people that have a connection to partition or India, and then people from all backgrounds to know more about this history. So that's where it came from.
Yeah, and that was one of my motivations for reading the book for my kids, because I just feel the whole partition era is still real because our grandparents or my kids' grandparents, some of them have gone through it. So it's very, I think historically, it's such an important book. The other angle is just from the mixed race families or interreligious households. My mother is Muslim, my father is Hindu. So there's another layer of, the way in which I've personally related, or my kids that related to this book that comes in. But let me bring in one of my favorite questions, which is about this book being an intergenerational book. As I've told you, that my family experienced this book and read through this book. And there is just so much power that comes from our parents, the word of mouth, telling the stories, which were never written about. And, when my boys read it with me, I told them the stories that I grew up with, which I think they cannot experience anywhere. And then when they read it with my mom, she told them her stories. Mm-hmm. So what reaction have you heard from people across age groups about the book from this multi-generational standpoint?
Yes, I've heard similar stories like that, and they're some of the stories that mean the most to me, because I think for the generation that went through partition, depending on what they experienced, my father, they were able to take a train and arrive safely. So they had to deal with a tremendous amount of loss, but they didn't confront some of the violence that so many people did have to confront. And so I think that I do have family members that did confront some violence, and it's too hard to talk about. It's not something they want to revisit. It's very traumatic. So I think that was part of why a lot of people haven't wanted to talk about this history of that generation, because it was too difficult. But I think people in our generation don't want this history to be lost. So I think this is one vehicle of, it's a story for young people. I purposely didn't sort of open up some of the most traumatic areas of partition, and there are many books to read more about that. But this was something I wanted a young person to be able to kind of handle and digest. At the same time, maybe read it with a grandparent, and then have it be a little bit of an easier vehicle to kind of open up those conversations. So I have heard stories like that. And just recently, my editor, who has actually a Hindu and a Sikh background, her daughter is finally old enough to read it. She was really young when she started editing the book, and her mother is visiting from India. And so she just sent me a picture of the three of them reading together. And that was just a huge full circle moment, because Namrata, my editor, was so, intimately involved in the writing of this book. And it meant so much to me to see that. So yeah, I love those stories.
Yeah. Now let's get into the main character in the book, Nisha. So one of the questions was, are there any similarities between you and Nisha?
There are many similarities. So I was very quiet growing up. I didn't have as much difficulty speaking in public the way Nisha does. And in this day and age, she's really struggling with kind of a very sort of specific kind of social anxiety. And I think that, she would have maybe been given different support and been recognized in a different way than just being seen as shy. But I was very shy growing up, and especially when I had to change schools, when I went to a very small school where everybody knew each other, and then I went to a much larger school, and the questions about my background and my identity kind of came up, and I didn't really know how to answer them, and I didn't have any new friends at my new school. And so I really turned to writing in diaries and reading a lot and kind of sort of withdrawing a little bit. But I think that was part of my journey as a writer, kind of being the shy observer in the background and kind of writing down the things that I thought that I was sort of afraid to talk about or afraid to ask. And Nisha does that in her diary. And I thought, because I was such a journal keeper when I was young, all the way through kind of elementary school through high school, college too, I have all these diaries that I kept over the years. So I just thought it would be interesting to create a fictional sense of that in this book, and have Nisha be able to, for the reader to see the difference of the way she was kind of in her public world and then the things she thought about privately. So I really connected to that part of Nisha. And, I'm from an interfaith family, but I'm from a Jewish and Hindu family, not a Hindu and Muslim family. But just those ideas through the lens of partition was something I was really interested in exploring as well.
So the next question is more about your writing style, and also about this book, the way it's written in the form of a letter. I've talked to you about this, that we used to read one letter every night together. Mm-hmm. And it's also like reading a journal entry every night. So let's talk a little bit about your writing style and the way in which you've written this book. How did you come up about, doing this very unique way of writing?
Right. Thank you. Well, so I was sort of kind of used to the diary format myself, as I just said, but at the same time, it is a letter. Each diary entry is a new letter to her mother. Her Muslim mother is no longer living. And I didn't figure that out until a little later in the writing process. So I decided I wanted it to be a diary format. And I had her just writing in a diary. Like, when somebody writes in a diary, you're just sort of writing to yourself, kind of the Dear Diary sort of format. And I was writing it that way, but something wasn't kind of moving the story forward. And I knew that her mother wasn't living anymore. But I didn't put it together. And then I thought it could be in this diary format, but also be letters to her mother. And somehow when I made that connection and gave her this sort of purpose of why she was writing this diary, and sort of to get to know her mother that she never knew and kind of create her on the page, that kind of kicked the story into, a different kind of, gave it a different kind of forward motion that I didn't have before. So that was one thing I was doing. It's hard to create a linear narrative in a diary format, in the sense of how do you show the other characters? I was always sort of confronting that. So, how do you hear their dialogue? How does the person who's writing, the character who's writing the diary, kind of explain things in scene form? So sometimes I do open up scenes in the diary, probably in a more kind of, typically fictional sense, than a real 12-year-old who's writing in her diary might take the care to kind of block out a scene. But I just sort of took that narrative leap and to sort of serve the reader and hope that they would kind of go with me on that.
Yeah, and that's actually a good segue. One of the questions that we got was, why is it easier for the main character, Nisha, to share her thoughts and feelings through a diary rather than through talking?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think anybody who's shy knows that, you are an observer, you become a really careful observer, because you are you're choosing in a lot of ways, or sometimes it's not really a choice, but you're kind of in the back watching everything happen, wondering, sort of gearing yourself up for like the courage to kind of speak. And it's but you feel really restricted, often really, I felt, growing up really self-conscious. Like when I spoke, suddenly, 20 eyes would be on me and I would be kind of in this spotlight that wasn't totally accurate. But when I started writing, and I wrote all kinds of things when I was young, I wrote poetry and plays and stories, and I really loved expressing myself that way. There was a freedom on the page because it was private. It was something that was just for me. I wasn't planning on showing anybody. And that gave me a real freedom to think things and say things that I wouldn't feel comfortable out loud. And so I sort of channeled that into Nisha.
So in your book, there are many themes that run through it, and we've talked about a few of them. So some of the themes are family, courage, hope, gratitude, friendship, and love. Can you speak to all those themes, and what is one of your favorite moments in the book?
Yeah, well, one of my it was a really hard scene to write, but because it was so difficult, I feel attached to it. It's when, so Nisha and Amil, they're twins, and when they are walking across the desert, there's, one point where they run out of water, and that was a problem that many people faced as they were walking, miles and miles, miles across the desert. How would you carry enough water? Where would you stop for water? And so they have kind of a water emergency, and Amil's really not doing well, and they're not sure if he's going to survive. And there's this moment, the Papa character in the book, he's very kind of stern, and he wants to just sort of keep things organized and keep everybody kind of, like in place, and to listen to him, because he feels the pressure to make sure everything's okay. He's a doctor, and so he's just used to sort of, caring for people in kind of in a survivor aspect, but not so much emotionally. So he's a little emotionally cut off, but he wants to be a good caretaker in that way. And so this is a moment where he's sort of broken down, and he just sees what he could lose, his family, that he hasn't always been emotionally connected to. And there's just this moment where it starts raining, and, and Papa comes, and they're all just sort of people trying to survive. They're not just sort of like the shy sister and the kind of, hyperactive brother and the stern father and the grandmother who's with them, their grandmother. They're just seeing each other as real human beings. And I think that families sometimes go through those periods when they're dealing with great joy or great sorrow of bonding together. You sort of see that bond, and you can't really feel it in any other way. And so I was kind of showing that. And then the hope that, they make it through this time. And I'm always kind of infusing my stories with hope, because I don't want to let my own hope die, and so anything I'm writing about that's difficult, I'm always going to kind of give it that hopeful tone. Yeah.
So, Veera, your book actually, as you know, I teach different languages and about Indian culture or South Asian culture. And I've noticed that your book has almost become like a go-to book for a lot of Indian American, Pakistani American kids. And, there is a huge awareness about your book. So one question that I personally have is, what role has language or heritage language played in your book, and whether there are any plans of translating any of your books, as a matter of fact, into any heritage languages that come from South Asia?
Yeah, I wish. So I don't have total control over that. It's really just, there's an American edition, or an English edition, I should say, released through Penguin, but there's no Hindi edition or Urdu edition or a Sindhi edition. And I wish that there was, but it's more up to kind of Penguin Random House as far as what rights they can sell and who's interested in all of that. So I don't sort of not always keyed in on exactly how that works. It's been translated into a number of different languages, French and Thai and Spanish, many different languages. But so I hope that it will be. I had to make the leap. So I am not multilingual, to my great shame. And so I don't really know Hindi or Sindhi or Urdu. And I wish I did, but I knew that I was writing in English about a family who would be speaking primarily Sindhi, Urdu, and Hindi eventually. And I was thinking of how do I really show that? And that was just really another leap. There's once in a while kind of words for food, but it's not. It's written in English mostly for a U.S. audience, because that's where I am and the perspective I'm coming from.
And we will end with this last question, which is just, we want to know what else is in works. What are your plans for any other books? I know you just recently came up with a new book. So if you can talk about a little more about that book as well as your projects.
Sure. So I do have another book out right now. It came out in the fall, and it's called How to Find What You're Not Looking For. And that is inspired more about my from my parents' marriage in 1968, when my parents decided to get married. During that time, it was a sort of dramatic moment in both their families, and they kind of decided to elope because they didn't really have the approval of their family at that time. And so I wrote a book. I also wanted to explore more of the Jewish side of my family. So I wrote a book from the perspective of a Jewish girl in 1967 whose older sister falls in love with a college student they're in Connecticut. But it's right after the Loving ruling, and kind of how that sort of affects and changes their family during that time, and based on some of the things my parents went through. But I'm also right now in the middle of writing a sequel to The Night Diary, and sort of following this family and seeing how they kind of continue their journey of rebuilding as survivors, and sort of what that means to survive something, and how do you sort of rebuild, and what do you kind of take with you, both the strengths and the wounds of what you've experienced. And so that's what I'm working on now.
Very exciting. I cannot wait to read that book. With that, I'm going to pass it back to Neelam